Okay, so I think we're good to go now. Where do we start? This current moment, where I think we're at, you know, I want to talk specifically, I don't want to actually talk for that long myself. I kind of want to open up to questions quite quickly and suggestions and talking. But I really wanted to address where I think we're at the current moment and the events that are coming up on the weekend, potentially. So at the current moment, we have a global, multi-ethnic, anti-racist movement inspired by Black American culture, inspired by Black Lives Matter, inspired by Black American soft power, inspired by all of that history. Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, James Brown. We all know the history behind why Black American culture has, in a sense, kind of a unique level of soft power among any group of oppressed people in the world. So that clearly, there's traction, there's momentum, there is major reforms being won. Things are very much on the side of those protests and those people, and that, broadly speaking, multi-ethnic, anti-racist coalition that you can see if you've been on any of the, of course, Angela Davis, if you've been on any of the protests, you'll know that. If you've been seeing the footage, you'll know that. And so now the fascists want to come out on Saturday in London to stage a counter protest. Understandably, you know, lots of the man them feel that they should go out and meet, and I understand that as a philosophy. I understand that as a way of thinking, but it seems to me that the fascists are losing ground culturally, politically, and intellectually, and so they have no choice but to try and provoke trouble on their terms, in their zones, in their area. And then, of course, knowing the police and knowing the right-wing press will be on their side, everything that happens, anything that bad that happens on Saturday will be black people's fault. I think there is a big difference between being willing to defend your community, yeah, if you need to, and you have to, and I obviously firmly believe in that, and what the man would call a draw-out, yeah? A draw-out is when you're just doing your own thing and a man just calls you out for no reason and you get drawn into an ambush. And if we look at the aftermath of the 2011 riots, as people will know, I do a lot of work in prisons. I worked with many young brothers doing major numbers in jail after the 2011 riots. I'm talking anything from 7s to right up to 30s, yeah? That isn't going to happen to the fascists because the police are on their side, right? So to any young brothers out there, I totally understand the way you're feeling. I know some young man will be like, oh, why is he saying that for? But I think responsibility, when I first saw that and I saw that was happening, I'm not going to lie to you, my ego got the better of me. And I was like, yo, man them, Saturday. And then I had a good long think about it and I slept on it for 2 days. And I realized, like I said, I think one of the important things, if you're a voice people listen to, is putting your own ego aside, yeah, and doing what you think is in the broader interest of your community. And right now the momentum is on our side, the culture is on our side, and what they want, like I said, is to win the only way they can win, which is provoking a particular incident or a particular unsavory outcome. Everyone can see the protests have been mostly peaceful. You're not fooling no one with the police charged through a few people and there was a little bit of trouble and a statue got spray painted. I mean, not even being in any way disrespectful, like you have what is a really peaceful middle class audience, in a way, multi-ethnic audience, uni students, yeah? There's an element of the community that will see that as a draw out and maybe get sucked in, and I feel a responsibility to those young brothers, many of whom are on parole, many of whom are on probation, as we call it over here, many of whom already got cases, many of whom want to represent and want to be out there for their community, and if all they understand is beef, then that's where they feel that they might be useful, right? For those young brothers in particular, stage a protest in your ends, innit? Yeah, do a solidarity protest in your ends. If you're east, if you're west, if you're north or south, you can stay in your ends and protest if you need to. Yeah, hold your corner, but go into the draw out. I really don't think it's wise. I really don't think it's sensible. And so I wanted to say that, and I felt I had a responsibility to say that. So I think really what we want to be talking about next. Obviously, listen. By the way, don't like take my word for it. And don't listen to what I say, by the way. This is, you do what you want, I'm giving you my opinion, by the way. Let me be clear that I'm not telling anyone what to do. Let me be abundantly clear about that. I'm not saying, I'm not your dad, I'm not the president of black people. People have asked for my opinion. This is my opinion on what is politically wise and what is strategically intelligent. So if you're watching this, I don't want you to think, well, who's my man to tell man what to do? Absolutely. I'm not telling anyone what to do. I'm telling you what I think is strategically intelligent. And if you look back at the history of anti-racist protests in London, and you look where battles were fought by our parents, they were fought in Lewisham. We won in Lewisham. They were fought in Tower Hamlets, Brick Lane. Shout out to the Brick Lane man. They were won in Brick Lane. They were fought in Ladbroke Grove. We won in Ladbroke Grove. They were fought in Peckham. We won in Peckham. They were fought in New Cross. They were fought in Brixton. They were fought in Handsworth. They were everywhere over the country. Broadly speaking, even trying to explain to people from countries that are perhaps more segregated, say France or the United States, trying even to explain to them that hood in England is multi-ethnic. Even a majority black neighbourhood, let's be honest, you go to the ends and White Tommy's one of the men there. If you're in North, Tottenham, Cypriot Thomas is one of the men then, right? And so there is a, broadly speaking, multi-ethnic working class culture in Britain that is, even though black people are disproportionately affected, even though there's specific issues, even though there's specific issues facing black people, there is still that in a way that perhaps isn't understood or isn't the same in, say, France or in the United States or elsewhere. And so to me, they want attention. If they come to London and they get no attention, they go home, no news, they lose. Yeah? If they come to London and they get what they want, which is a conflict, we all know the entire right-wing press is going to make it black people started a race war. And clearly no black people are taking that position, and that is not the position black people are taking, that is not the position the anti-racist protesters are taking. And so that is my opinion on that. I think this is a time for grassroots community organising. I think this is a time for community self-defence. I think this is a time for supporting mutual aid organisations, so soup kitchens, breakfast clubs. We can all see the massive economic downturn that's coming. Obviously with Corona, loads of people have lost their jobs. Right now is the time to support your community and to build on the ground, and to if you're an OG in your ends and you've got support in your ends and you've got love in your ends and people respect you in your ends, organise locally in your ends, organise the momentum in your ends. Now is the time for squashing beef. That's what now is the time for, yeah? And if a time comes where our communities are attacked, we should never be the provokers. We should never be the ones seeking trouble. If our communities are attacked, of course, I am not a pacifist, and I believe firmly in self-defense, which is your legal right. Let's be clear, is your legal right. Act within the law, defend yourself within the law. But allow the draw acting is my take on it. So that was really the main thing I wanted to say, because I have been concerned, and really I'm interested in solutions. What's next? What are we building? Every week now I'm going to start posting up community organisations every Sunday. So start getting them together. I've been posting them out in general. If people are organising, if you've got a soup kitchen, if you've got a community organisation, if you've got a fund building something in the ends anywhere, if you're doing work in Africa or Asia or elsewhere, just every week I'm going to start posting up stuff, positive stuff. If you're running a workout club in your ends, do that. So let's start building that. Let's start making a new. We're already doing it. What's wicked is the current moment. It's now almost become everyone's on the same wave, innit? All of the man are on the wave of, nah, it's building time. We did that stuff when we was younger, and we might have made mistakes or whatever else, but actually now is community building time, and I think everyone's broadly agreed on that. I think all the music man on this live alone will tell you we're at a stage where, even if we weren't all the best of friends when we was 21, at this age, as grown men, we're all like, yo, I love you, brother, I want well for you, like, and we're building, and so it is a really beautiful time, and I do not want these people to get all the attention and take away from what is actually quite, for all the tragedy and for all the problems, is in a sense a beautiful moment. So I'm going to open up to questions and just start answering some questions. But that was something I felt like I needed to share on. First question: how does everyone go about uprooting and going back to Africa? Funny, good question. I don't endorse that as a political strategy, and I do not believe that is the strategy Marcus Garvey advocated for. In fact, what Garvey said was, men who are useless outside of Africa are going to be useless in Africa. I think there are people in Africa already doing great work. There are people in Africa already smarter than we are on the ground about what the challenges are on the ground. Until recently, the Chinese diaspora produced more wealth. The 3 or 4 million Chinese people living outside of China produced more wealth than the entire country of China with all its 2 billion people. For the whole African diaspora to go back to Africa is not sensible. We have the right to live wherever we want. We have the right to be whoever we are. We should fight for justice, equal rights, equal opportunities, wherever we are in the world. Yeah. That does not mean, however, we should not just black people, all responsible human beings, but particularly people of African heritage, should have a stake in seeing Africa prosper and seeing the problems that exist in Africa cease to be so bad. So I think the question I would put to you who asked that question is, what role can the African diaspora play in Africa's development? Is a better way of phrasing it than we should all go back and live in Africa, because I don't believe in that. Not to say I wouldn't live in Ghana or Senegal, by the way. They're my 2 at the moment that I am considering. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying I don't support the mass repatriation. Let's scroll for a few more. Do I feel it will make an economic impact if we only invest in black British-owned businesses? I think that community self-development is important. I think that African Caribbean people building an economic base as an ethno-cultural group is important, the way many other communities do. And then you develop trade from a place of mutual respect and from a place of mutual respect. We don't need to boycott anyone else's business, but we do need, obviously, racism is also about class, right? And having no economic base makes you more susceptible to racism. As everyone knows, I'm also quite critical of capitalism, so I'm not just going to say, right, oh, if it's just a black business, then it's a good business. Some black businesses are exploitative. Some black businesses are not worth supporting. So I think that, yes, I firmly believe in Pan-African community self-development, absolutely. But then once you've made that development, you might buy XYZ from that community. You might buy XYZ from that community. You might trade XYZ with that community. So I don't think necessarily the strategy, no group of people boycott everything produced by everyone else. I just think, but I do think now is a time for, again, community self-development is the way I would put it. Good question there. Other than teaching black history in schools, what else can teachers do to support, I'm trying to read the whole question. What else can teachers do? I presume you mean to support anti-racism. I can't read the whole question. I don't think it's just about teaching black history. That's the thing. I think the way it's phrased, for example, is that the history of racial slavery in the Americas is black history. No, it's as much British history. If we're talking about the history of slavery in Jamaica, that's part of Britain's history. So Britain, for example, we talk a lot about the abolition of slavery. We'll erect a statue of Wilberforce or a painting of Wilberforce. But Sam Sharp, the Jamaican who led the largest slave rebellion in British history, is as much part of Britain's history as anything else. He helped lead to the abolition. That rebellion was just 2 years before the abolition of slavery. Sam Sharp is part of British history. And so I think even phrasing it as Black History, which I get why it is, we have Black History Month, that's very important to correct a lot of the misconceptions about Africa and the Caribbean. But understanding that Britain, a lot of people understand Britain had an empire. Very few people understand that Britain was an empire, i.e. the history of the entire British Empire is British history. And that's the way I would phrase it, that's the way I would get it into the curriculum. The only way we're going to have peace and respect in a increasingly multi-ethnic society is if people understand where others are coming from. And if children, not just black children either, if white kids are being taught, as many have been taught for generations now, slavery happened, black people sat around doing nothing and they waited for William Wilberforce to come and save them, that's not good for anybody. Because then when black people do rebel, people are going to be like, oh, what happened to these people? I thought they were the people that just sit around and do nothing and wait for white saviors. Whereas if you teach the real history, everyone can sort of deal with this contentious issue in a bit more of a mutually respectful manner. If the actual history is, there was this history of racial slavery, very brutal, very horrible. Only once in the whole history of the world has a group of people staged a successful slave revolution. That happens to be Africans in the Caribbean. It stops being a story that's about victimhood and it starts actually being a story about revolutionary success. And can you see that for black children in particular, that is a very different way of learning the history of slavery than just, you know, your ancestors sat around waiting for Wilberforce. And even for white kids, it's like, right, their men were on job. Their ancestors got enslaved, they burned down plantations, they fought back. And that is a major part of what led to the abolition of slavery. So it's also about just teaching the whole story. Yeah. But yeah, I think for teachers, I think it's that, and I think it's also one other piece of advice for teachers is just being conscious of the way in which race and class and other things have affected people's perception of students, and not feeling. A lot of teachers I've found that feel so scared of being called a bigot that they often don't even want to examine whether or not they've dealt with a child differently, because it's the big black guy, so it's the big black kid, so I've projected my fears and insecurities onto that children. So it's also being conscious of that. I'm just scrolling through a few questions, by the way. Great question here. What should we be asking of the education system more broadly? Well, first of all, the education system everywhere in the world, and particularly in Britain, evolved in the context of a class-based society, right? There was never the idea that poor kids was going to get the same education as rich kids, yeah? So in that context, still now, kids are going to school and they're being taught stuff that just isn't true. They're being taught Britain is an equal society, equal opportunities. Do you think the kids who go to private school, they get taught to be manual labourers or to work in a hairdresser's or any of those kind of things? No, of course they don't. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with those jobs. My pops was a manual labourer. No, I rate that. Honest day's work. But let's just be honest with young people, that if you go to a state school, you're being educated to get a working class job. And if you happen to be exceptionally talented, very bright, lucky enough to have great parents, they might pluck you out and send you to a posh school so that you don't infect all the other plebs with the idea that you can just be whatever you want. So in a class-based society, the education system does not teach. I left school with straight A's. I never knew what capitalism was when I left school. I left school with straight A's. I never knew what a mortgage was when I left school. I left school with straight A's. I never knew what interest rate was when I left school. So all of these things, I never knew how to set up a limited company. I never knew how to grow food. So there are very specific things we're being taught in school. I never learned self-defense. So for me, someone just put they teach imperialism in private schools. Exactly, right? So for me, if I was Minister of Education tomorrow, I would be teaching kids how to grow their own food, how to farm their own land, what capitalism was, what interest rates were. If we're going to do capitalism, at least give working class kids an equal chance to compete within the economy as it exists, which they're not doing. So I would reform the education system in a major way to make it much more meritocratic. There are some countries, as someone just pointed out here, ironically, a country like Jamaica, if you're an extremely bright kid from the ghetto, you can realistically become the Minister of Education, as has happened. If you're from a rural poor family, because there is a system in Jamaica where if you're extremely, extremely bright, you can work your way up and go to one of the better schools. So I'd bring in something like that, but I also would have major reforms in terms of what people are taught. Practical skills, vocational skills, and life skills. Relationships. Parenting is not taught at school. Shout out to a man like Loki. No one teaches you how to be a parent, the biggest job you're ever going to have to do. I would make a major reform to GCSE entry. My biggest pet peeve right now, even with the system as it currently is, the way it works in British schools, we have standardised universal criteria. We have standardised universal testing. So you have GCSEs and you have no standardised criteria for entry. Yeah. So what happens is, and the government knows this, the state knows this, working class white kids, their actual measured intelligence is, say here on average, they did a national study. The way teachers assess their intelligence is lower, yeah? Lower than their actual intelligence. So if you're a white kid from a poorer background, teachers often assume that you're not as bright as you are, and we get that. Let's be honest. You hear a Liverpool accent or a hood, Cockney accent or whatever, people have certain perceptions. For black children in particular, regardless of social class, what happens is children are much less likely to be entered for higher tier exams, and teachers under-assess their intelligence by a much greater degree than any other people, regardless of class. So I would reform that system, and I would make GCSE entrance based solely on your SAT scores, and you would see that actually that would make things much more meritocratic. I go into this a lot in Natives. I've got 2 chapters on education, and so all of the citations are there. I don't want people to think I'm just being conspiratorial. I look at all of the data on that. But yeah, let me go to our next question. Okay, so I'll answer that one. Even though I did a thread on this the other day. The thoughts on black crime. I mean, unless the violence in Naples, in the hood in Naples, there's a hood in Naples called Scampia, Secondigliano. Anyone who's watched Gomorrah knows what I'm talking about, right? But I've actually been to Naples, right? In the hood in Naples, people sell drugs, people kill people. Like any hood anywhere, right? In the hood in Glasgow, people sell drugs, people kill people. In the hood in Mexico, people sell drugs, people kill people. We've got to ask ourselves why in all of those cases where class is clearly the primary connector, when trading illegal drugs plus lack of opportunity is clearly the common denominator, why only for black kids does black on black violence get offered? And even if you're a mixed race ex-road youth like me, it's the black half's fault that you was violent, right? It's black on black violence. This is the biggest gaslighting waste of argument ever. Black on black violence doesn't exist. You think if black roadmen get robbed by a Turkish man, they're going to be like, well, you know what? They're not black, so I'm not going to clap back or do nothing. Even though I owe my Connect money and I'm in beef now, I don't kill black people. Of course not. And if you want to put that to the test, go and rob some black roadman and see what happens. I wouldn't recommend it, right? Furthermore, do you think white road youths in Liverpool would pet to beef the man then? Of course they would, right? Who do you think is a greater risk of going to prison? A white youth from the hood in Liverpool whose parents are on drugs, for example, which is the case of some of the youths I've worked with, or a middle-class black youth who lives in Richmond? Even if you just look at rap music, how do you think all the rich rappers' kids are going to grow up? Man have got detached houses with back gardens. It turns out rich black rappers like back gardens and cups of tea and hot yoga and red wine just as much as other people with money, right? So once, even if you look at some of the man them in this call, we've all known each other since our early 20s when our friends were on nonsense. Let's be honest. What happened? Did we all get an excessive melanin reduction operation sometime around 25? No, we grew up and we started to be successful. So black on black violence doesn't exist. It's a gaslight. For example, imagine when, this last thing I'll say on this, imagine when every time a middle-aged white man had a political opinion, if we gaslit them with, yeah, but until there's no more middle-aged white men who are paedophiles, I don't care about Brexit. How can you have an opinion on Brexit, Nigel Farage? There's still white on white sexual violence. And so I think that it's just a gaslight, bruv. Yes, don't get me wrong. Yes, we should be working to clean up the violence in the hood. Yes, we should be working for unity in black neighborhoods, but there's no violence among middle-class black people. Even in Jamaica, which has one of the highest murder rates in the world, if you live in Cherry Gardens or Norbrook or Plantation Heights, you might as well live in Hampstead. It's lovely, lovely. I'm considering moving there. That's how lovely it is. So violence everywhere in the world, street violence, is based on much more on class than race. Ghana has a murder rate that is no higher than Belgium's murder rate. In fact, there's only one city in the whole of Africa. Outside of South Africa, there is no city in the whole of Africa in the world's top 50 for murder rate. Outside of South Africa. Only South Africa on the whole continent of Africa. Only South Africa has cities that are in the top 50 in the world for murder rate. All of the rest of the top 50 of the cities in the world are in the Americas. And even with London, if you chat to most people in London, even most black youths, and you say, hey, do you think London is the most violent city in Britain? They'll say yes, it isn't. Usually it comes around 7 or 8. If you ask them what percentage of violent murders do you think are committed by black youths in London? Young black boys, should I say, or black teenagers. I've asked teenagers this question, they say 80%, 90%. No, it's about 15% of the murders are committed by black teenagers. Then some are committed by the man then. But this, again, the whole thing is just gaslighting. We can care about more than one political issue at once. And most of us who have an opinion on police brutality and are out there doing work have also been in the streets trying to get the man them to do other things and trying to provide employment for people and trying to clean up our community. So it's an extra gaslight because the two sets of people are often very connected. Great question. What do I think are the impact of the UK media on black children? Well, you've only got to go to a majority black society to see the difference. I've worked in schools all over Africa. I've worked in schools in some of the supposedly wickedest ghettos in Jamaica. And what struck me, I went to a school called Jonestown Boys, which is on the border of Arima and Denham Town. Any yard man in the house will tell you that's the hood, right? When I said to the young boys in this class, what do you want to be when you're older? You know what the first response was? Man said, marine biologist. What's a marine biologist, big man? I had to go Google it. 12-year-old boy from the wickedest ghetto in Kingston, marine biologist. The next boy said lawyer. Next youth said judge. The point is, of course, young black children from the ghetto in Jamaica understand that their disadvantages are based on class. They know that there's no ceiling for them because they're black. There's a ceiling for them because they're poor. And so you see the constant bombardment of negative images about black people. How do you expect it not to affect young black boys? If young black boys think 90% of the murders in London are being done by the man them, they're going to go out in the street on smoke for the man them. And equally, you've only got to look at working class white kids. You know how much schools I've been to in the north of England where I'm working with working class white kids, and they make fun of each other for being clever because they've internalized the idea that being clever is not their identity. The funny part about it is there's a long history of working class white intelligentsia in Britain. You think about people like Richard Hogarth or E.P. Thompson, but the class system in Britain is like magic. It convinces people to behave against their own interests. Yeah, and so this idea that it's just a black issue, nah, the African kids in England are doing better in school than mixed race kids, than black English kids, and than poor white kids. You'll never see that in the UK media. Even when I pointed it out on the news, everyone was like, "No, I never even thought about it like that," and now I think about it, every uni I go to, it's bare Ghanaian and Nigerian youths. Shock horror, because enough of the Ghanaian and Nigerian and Zimbabwean young people in Britain, their parents had uni degrees before they got here, big man. They might be physically in Peckham, they might be physically in Tottenham, they might be physically in Hackney, but their parents had uni degrees before they got here. So it's no surprise that they're doing well in school, even in the facts of racism. And their parents, let's be real, I can see all my Niger and Ghana brethrens and people and supporters and everyone on here with the flags. If you don't go uni, your parents are going to stop chatting to you. Let's be honest, yeah. So there's all of that side of it as well. So I think that having a more accurate image of black households and ordinary black life, and not thinking that everything's all got to be dramatic, is really, really important. This is a good question here. Do I think social revolution in America is possible, or is it just a pipe dream? I don't know. I mean, that's a question well beyond my expertise to ask. Can America reform itself without major violence? Can any capitalist society reform itself properly without major violence? I don't know. I'd like to think so. America has major reforms have happened in America. Major reforms have happened in many countries around the world, but whether or not there'll be, and it depends what you mean when you say revolution. When you look throughout history, many revolutions have only led to reforms anyway. Yeah, and so I don't see the two things as mutually exclusive. Yeah, even after the revolution, quote unquote, you still got to build a better functioning society, and that's no mean feat. It's one of the reasons I don't go around saying a lot of the trendy stuff that you see on Twitter, smash capitalism, blah blah blah, all this kind of stuff, because I think I have a responsibility as someone that, especially a particular set of young brothers, listen to me. I have a responsibility to pick my words carefully and wisely. And I think that trendy Twitter stuff is cool, but as someone who has actually managed businesses and managed organizations my whole life, I realize, if I have a hard enough time managing my family, and keeping the disagreements in my family from overspilling, if I have a hard enough time managing my business and managing my youth organization, running a country is real tough. And so even after this revolution, whatever that means, the task of building a more functional society still awaits us. You think of Africa and the Caribbean. We've had many revolutions in Africa and the Caribbean, and yet the monumental task of playing civilizational catch-up, as I like to call it, with Europe and Asia is still there. Yeah, African countries, Caribbean countries still lag behind technologically, economically, in loads of places and in loads of ways. So even though we've had revolutions, we got rid of formal colonialism in Africa, and it was tough. We got rid of slavery in the Caribbean, and it was very tough, or rather our ancestors did. We still got to get the architects, the doctors, the scientists, the engineers, so on and so forth, hold our corrupt governments to account, so on and so forth. All of those challenges still await, and I don't have the answer to all of that. And anyone that tells you that they do, I would suggest to you is a charlatan. Yeah, anyone that thinks they have all of the answers about all of the world's problems is fibbing to you, bruv. And in fact, you might know or have better answers or better things to say on that than me, but major things are happening and major things are changing, so we'll see in it. Boom, boom, boom. Going back to the questions. Yes, man, like Henry, well, go on, old school. I'm seeing a couple old school names pop up there, you know, man, them I ain't seen for a minute. Well, go on. Thoughts on the Democratic Party and Joe Biden? Man don't support the Democratic Party, man don't support Joe Biden. So that one's quick. I like this one. Um, do you think black conservatives who speak against and minimise the plight of black people? I can't figure out how to see the rest of the question. Um, I've lost that question, but let me come to it. No, it was further down. So someone was asking a question about black conservatives. I saw the beginning of it. Do I think black conservatives minimise the plight of? Oh, there we go. Minimise the plights of black people. ... How do I see the whole of these questions? Someone post up how, because it's not coming up. But anyway, I presume the rest of the question. I'm going to assume the rest of the question is for approval or I don't know what. What I'll say is this. There are two types of black conservatism, in my opinion, right? There is the tradition of do for self, almost black nationalist conservatism, which in a sense you could argue, I wouldn't call Garvey a conservative in any meaningful sense, but in a sense you could argue sort of Booker T. Washington to a lesser degree, though it's much more complicated when you look at what Garvey said about Lenin, you look at other sorts of things. Garvey wasn't a conservative in any meaningful sense in that way. But I can respect black conservatives that are in the hood doing work. So if Thomas Sowell was in Harlem with a business school, I could say, you know what, I disagree with him, but he's putting his money where his mouth is and he's putting his ideas into practice. Instead, he sits on his high horse from Stanford University, basically cussing black Americans and saying black Americans have got a redneck culture. Now, what I've done over the last year, because man's just smoky like that, I love to use the kids' words, it's safe. You can tell a man's getting old when he forces young people's words into his sentence. I read about 6 or 7 of Thomas Sowell's books just to see, is he really serious, right? Is he really got something so amazing to say? And on the one hand, some of the things Thomas Sowell had to say were interesting, were provocative, were fascinating, about 10%, 20% of it, but the rest of it was just bollocks, bro. There's no other way to put it. There were so many lies in there. For example, he has an essay called The Real History of Slavery, in which he argues that the history of the abolition of slavery was entirely to do with the West, and he just completely ignores the Haitian Revolution. His general argument is that culture is the greatest predictor of human outcome. Then he has an essay where he says the Holocaust had nothing to do with German culture. He argues in Wealth, Poverty and Politics that, or he tries to convince his readers in Wealth, Poverty and Politics that the riots in 2011 in England were basically anti-rich riots committed by poor white kids. If you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. He ignores Mark Duggan, doesn't mention it completely. So there are such huge flaws in his social history. I'm not qualified to argue with him about economics, but there are such huge flaws in his social histories that I just don't trust him. And I think any analysis, especially if we know the history of intelligence agencies flooding drugs into America, for example, scholars who ignore that, I'm like, on top of that, in all of his books, I have not found one sentence that is even vaguely critical of American foreign policy. How seriously am I supposed to take that? And so I would say that there is, like I said, the do-for-self black conservatism, and then there is the black conservatives who, as you can see with someone like Candace Owens, for example, a really mediocre person can build a huge platform just saying stuff racist people want to hear, overnight, basically. And if you've read her work, you'll know that she's just extremely mediocre. And the only reason she's got a platform that large is because she says stuff racist people want to hear. And so I think that's sad. And I think when someone's coming out at a time like this saying George Floyd weren't a nice person, that's what you're really willing, that's the energy you want to put into the world. The police have killed someone and that's the energy you want to put into the world. I think that tells you everything you need to know about that particular tradition of black conservatism. Rather than some black conservatives, you know, like church pastors who are not corrupt, for example, there's some of those kind of people, they're quite conservative in a way, but they're in the hood doing work. I can respect that, that's fine, as long as you're putting your actions where your mouth is and you're serving your community. But if you're a political conservative, no worries. I'm not one of these self-righteous lefties who's like, you must all think the way I think, otherwise you're a bad person. There are entirely legitimate reasons to have a different view about the way a national economy should be run. That is very different from running around begging for approval from racist people. Do you see what I mean? That I can't respect that at all. I can't rate that at all. That's some idiot thing, basically. I don't like bad-mouthing individuals, but that's my opinion on that. I like to concentrate on ideas more than individuals. Kelechi said, with mediocre hair, Alexa. Yeah, there you go. That's basically what it is, isn't it? Like, I don't, like I said, I don't like picking on individuals, but I don't rate Homegirl at all. Thoughts on reparations? Yep, I think there is an entirely valid case to be answered for reparatory justice. Remember, Haiti never stopped paying reparations to France till 1947. The bonds that were taken out so Britain could pay slave masters compensation, reparations for losing their slaves, British taxpayers did not stop paying them off until 2015. That means British Caribbean taxpayers were paying back the bonds that were used to pay back slave masters. This ain't ancient history, and people want to act like 200 years ago. 200 years ago, we're talking about no. Man finished getting paid the other day, and so I think there's an entirely legitimate case to be answered. Which brings me on to one thing which you lot ain't asked a question about, but there is a really toxic thing I see among some Caribbeans and some Black Americans running around saying that Africans sold us into slavery. I would recommend every single one of you exercise some common sense and think a bit more about history, and I'll explain why. But also read, there's a book called Resisting the Slave Trade, West African Strategies. The reason why I say this is because, firstly, political treachery has been normal among every group of people for all of human history, right? The Visigoth Spaniards invited the Moors in to conquer them. The Chinese helped the British sell opium in China. The Indian elite profited from the Bengal famine. The Anglo-Irish landlords profited from the famine in Ireland, and on and on and on, right? What actually happened in West Africa was that some people, of course, sold human beings, just as some black people would sell human beings today. Just as some people of every ethnicity today are engaged in human trafficking. What many of you have been so successfully brainwashed into believing is that there was no resistance in Africa itself. There were more rebellions on the west coast of Africa against transatlantic slavery than any island in the Caribbean. So tell the whole story. If you want to say there were African slave trades, of course there were, no problem. Just tell the whole story though, innit? There were more rebellions, I'm going to repeat that, on the west coast of Africa against transatlantic slavery than any island in the Caribbean. On top of that, the Haitian Revolution was fought by people born in Africa. Where do you think they learned to fight like that, Regin? They were in armies in Africa. They were in armies in the Congo. They were in armies in Ghana. Most of the people who fought the Haitian Revolution were Africans. The Maroons in Jamaica were not born in Jamaica. They were born in Ghana. Where do you think they learned to fight like that? They learned those particular military tactics in West Africa. So all I'm saying is just tell the whole story. Some black people would sell you down the river tomorrow for money because that's how human beings work. Some of our own families would backstab us for money because that's how human beings work. But this idea that Africans were, on top of it, there's this idea that there's Africans, them and us. No black Americans, Jamaicans or Caribbeans left West Africa. The only people that left West Africa were Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, Ibibio, Wolof, Tukulor, Puel. They were Africans. They were Congo, they were Lingala, etc., etc., etc. So this idea that there was us and them, what about the African families left behind whose families got sold into slavery? You're not interested in their story? You're not interested in what they did to get their family members back? Your literal cousins were left behind. So that's one thing I really want to address because a lack of honesty around the history. Last thing I'll say on it, and some of those same Caribbeans and black Americans who say that are much less quick to talk about the history of Liberia. Yeah? Let's talk the whole thing. Much less quick to talk about the fact that the Maroons fought in the conquest of Ashanti, or that they did a deal with the British to preserve slavery. I'm not even passing a judgment on it all. History is very complicated, and no one knows what they would do in a given situation if they weren't there. Just tell the whole story, innit? Yeah? The Haitian Revolution was a continuation of African resistance in Africa. The Jamaican Maroons were a continuation of African resistance in Africa. Africa was not a paradise. There was class in Africa, like there is everywhere else in the world. African elites in one social class, willing to do things to their own commoners that they weren't willing to do people of their social class or of a different ethnicity, and so on and so forth. But this kind of simplistic blanket Africa. Last thing I'll say on it, I promise. The distance between Timbuktu and Luango, yeah, which is the capital of the old empire of Congo, is greater than the distance from London to Istanbul. That's how big Africa is. And those two places are like this far apart on a dot in a map in West Africa. So you're telling me the whole of Africa was just one polity on top of all of that? There weren't different ethnic groups, there weren't different cultures, there weren't different histories, and so on and so forth, right? So just tell the whole story. We don't need romanticism, but we don't need foolishness neither. We've only got about 15 minutes left because obviously it cuts off at 1 hour. So let me try and race through a few more questions. Thoughts on diversity and lack of leadership. It is what it is. I think there's a space to build people's own institutions, but there is a place. I'm not one just for the black faces in higher places kind of thing. Obama was a black face in a high place. I mean, I rate them boy they are tall, you know. So it was also important that the black face in high place, has interest for his particular community, but and more importantly, like, it's just a decent human being, right? I don't want no, bruv. Some of our leaders, let's be honest, I don't rate them, bruv, at all. They're thieves. I don't rate them just because they're black. Idiot thing. So diversity in leadership is as important that the person has some integrity and has their community's interest at heart as it is that they just look like you. So I think it's that balance too, though, innit? Because we're seeing some of the people pushing the worst immigration policies in the country right now. Some of the people who voted for the war in Iraq, for example, they might look just like the man them. I don't rate them people. Let's be honest. I want people that I agree with broadly about politics too. I don't just want optics. Yeah, as it's just been put, I don't just want optics. Don't think you can just feed me a black face and I'm gonna get excited. I understand why for black Americans, emotionally, because they lived under apartheid in a way that we didn't in the same way in Britain, emotionally having a black leader was really important for them. I get that, I totally understand that. For us in Britain, we come from majority black countries where some of the leaders are idiots. You think you could just fool us with a black politician? We know some of them are fools, Bridget. Or as the Jamaican Rastas put it, even though Rastas are black nationalists, down with white and black oppressors. We're not just trying to replace white oppressors with black oppressors, yeah? So I think that, yes, representation is important. Yes, diversity in leadership is important, but credentials is important, though, innit? Man said Priti Patel, bruv. I'm not even, yo, Bridget. Mandatory books to read on African history. I've got a whole series of 40 book reviews on my YouTube channel, and I've got a whole series of African history books attached. If you Google Akala African history books, it comes up because my Oxford Union lecture, I did an old blog with a list on there, but if you go onto my YouTube channel, which is at Akala Music, just like this, I've got a review of 40 books on there. But the specific African history book list, you have to Google that because that's on another page. And there's a whole bibliography at the back of natives as well. I will make sure I save this live. Like I won't mess it up like I did last time. Good question here. I'm going to address this one because this one can be confusing for a lot of people. Is calling ourselves black as mixed race men denying half of our heritage? In my view, absolutely not. Race is political, not biological. If I'd have grown up in Jamaica, I might have been a high colour uptown Kingstonian. If I'd have grown up in South Africa, I might have been coloured. If I'd have grown up in Brazil, I don't know what they would have classed someone of my complexion as. If Angela Davis and Malcolm X had grown up in the Caribbean, the whole perception of them would have been different based on colorism, right? Yet in America, they were one drop rule black. Obviously, everyone can see that those of us who are of mixed black-white heritage have one black parent and one white parent. I don't think anybody thinks, that, both of my parents are from Senegal. I think people can clearly see that I'm mixed. So by affirming your blackness, you are affirming, in my view, a loyalty to justice. Revolutionary black nationalism is not about hating anyone else, right? It is about supporting justice. It gave the world the first slave revolution in human history. It gave the world the ending of apartheid. It gave the world the ending of Jim Crow. It is a tradition that is about freedom. Mulatto nationalism has achieved nothing. Yeah, mulatto sticking together on the basis of being mulatto, all it really did was man owning a few slaves and taking up a place in the slave hierarchy in the Caribbean. So obviously people can see we're mixed. I think it's also important to ask why you can identify as black as a mixed person, but you cannot identify as white. And the reason for this is because white supremacist identity is a racially pure identity. You have to be 100% white to be white. Most other identities in the world are ethnic identities. So if you're Celtic, I could be Celtic, for example, right? Even though I'm half black, that doesn't undermine my Celtic identity. If I was born in Nigeria and I spoke Yoruba, people might made fun of me for being lighter. But from I speak Yoruba and I'm from the village and I'm culturally Yoruba, people would see me as more of as a Yoruba man than a fully black Yoruba person born in England who is culturally English, right? So I don't want to romanticize anywhere in the world because there's issues everywhere in the world, but I think it's important to understand why race is defined the way it is and why for me, going around being like, I'm mixed race, I'm mixed race, I'm mixed race, as if people can't see that, is a way of saying I'm not black, I'm not one of them. And I personally don't take that position. And on top of that, I'm not judging no one else. I went to Pan African Saturday School. My stepdad was the stage manager of the Hackney Empire, which was London's most important black-led community institution. So I had a very black upbringing. My mum, this will help you understand why I am the way I am. My mum got kicked out of the house when she was 16 for Oyimbo, I seen, for, you know, being with a black guy, and then was basically adopted by my dad's family and by a family of Guyanese Jamaican radicals. So culturally, my entire upbringing was a culturally radical Caribbean upbringing. So it was the only culture I knew. So it was what it was. So I think there's also that part of it, that a lot of this is about culture. We've only got about 8 minutes left because, boy, the hour come. Boom, boom, boom. Quite a few people joined after my words on the protest at the beginning. I just want to highlight, if you go back to the beginning of this live when I posted on stories, I gave my thoughts already. It'll be on my YouTube channel as well about what I think is happening this Saturday. Great question here. Thoughts on prison reform, rehabilitation. I must confess, I have not read a lot of the literature on prison abolition. Yeah, so I know people. Right, everyone's saying another hour. I haven't read the literature on prison abolition, so I can't comment on prison abolition. There does need to be massive prison reform. Yeah, currently Britain has the largest prison population in the whole of Western Europe by miles, absolutely by miles. Yeah, why? We don't have significantly more murders than France. We don't have significantly more rapes than France. We don't have significantly more violence than Germany. 71% of the people in prison in Britain are in for non-violent crimes. So clearly we have a huge problem here with the way our justice system is set up. And of course, that is totally class-based. It's about locking up poor kids from Glasgow and Belfast and Newcastle, and specifically for young black boys. So yes, we need massive prison reform, and we need to start pushing for that strongly. We need to start divesting money from prisons to schools, to early community intervention programs, and this is the time to start pushing that agenda. Yeah, we need to start diverting money from prisons budgets and from police's budgets into community organisations, and showing that we can reduce crime this way, right? And showing that we can bring down crime in this way, because investing in people earlier makes more of a difference. Netherlands is a great example. Norway is a great example. Elsewhere, we will do another half an hour. We won't do another hour. We'll do another half an hour, because I can see everyone's got loads more comments and questions. So we'll do 30 minutes. I will log back on. I can see the popular call for it. So I'll log back on at 10 when this finishes, and we'll do 30 minutes more, but we won't do another hour. It'll be only 30 minutes. And I will stick to that, I promise, because, boy, I saw it go. But yeah, we'll do 30 more minutes. Let me look for a few more questions. But yeah, I do believe strongly in prison reform. Question here, would we benefit from black-only schools? Well, the funniest part about it is we already have black-only schools in London. Just look around. We just don't have schools that are designed to serve the communities that attend them. I've worked in schools in Peckham, 99.9% black youths. So it's already a black school, but it's just not a school running the interests with a curriculum designed to serve the kids who go to that school. So it's not about saying, do I think we benefit from only black schools? We have them. And the Black Saturday schools already exist. And they're doing very well. Check out East Side Young Leaders Academy, West Side Young Leaders Academy, South Side Young Leaders Academy. Those schools already exist. And this is an example of, right, so often the way racism works is about achieving racist outcomes without stating racist intent. So for example, and the great thing about it is often the people involved in it don't even understand what's going on. When the free school movement started, no one was going to say this is about allowing middle class white parents to pull their children out of increasingly ethnic state schools. But anyone with a pair of eyeballs can see that's what's happened. Yeah, London, one of the most multi-ethnic cities in the world. I go to Tower Hamlets right now. I'm going to go to a school 94% Bengali. I went to one 94% Bengali. I go to school in Peckham, 99% black. I've been to a school in Hackney, 99% black. Are those areas 99% black? Of course not. But what happens is two different sets of people are getting a very different type of education, even though they live in the same area, based on their parents' resources and partly based on ethnicity. So I think that we have to be clear that often what the establishment does is pushes essentially a racist agenda, or an agenda of the privileging of white interests, but doesn't state racist intent, and therefore it doesn't look racist. And so those are some of the things we've got to think about. But I think we also need a better curriculum overall. I'm gonna ask for go for a few more questions. So shall I save this one and log back in and do another? So I'm going to save this one right here before it goes to the hour, and log back in and do another half an hour. So I'm coming off now. I'll log back in, come and join us again, and we'll do a final half an hour. I'm going to save this video to stories. Safe.